Welcome, everyone. We've had over 1,600 alumni register for this event from literally all over the world. My name is Bob Manson, and I live in Dublin, Ireland. I was class of 2004 from the Harvard Kennedy School, and I currently serve on the executive committee of the Harvard Alumni Association. And like Dan, I'm a bit of a runner. We're going to be together for the next hour or so, and we want to have some fun while we're here. Dan's going to deliver some prepared remarks, followed by a lively discussion between the two of us based on your questions. I just want to address a couple of housekeeping points at the outset. So closed captioning is available during this program. Please click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen to turn them on or off. Today's program is on Zoom webinar. If you have any questions for Dan during the program, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to do so. And please include your name and class here if possible. Our speaker today is Professor Dan Lieberman. I'm going to read his bio from his new book, Exercised, The Science of Physical Activity, Rest and Health, which forms the basis of our conversation today. Daniel Lieberman is the Edwin M. Lerner II Professor of Biological Sciences and a professor of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. In fact, Dan is the chair of that department. He is a leading figure in the field of human evolution and its relevance to health. He is renowned for his research on the evolution of running, which he also enjoys himself, sometimes barefoot, earning him the nickname the Barefoot Professor. He has published over 150 peer-reviewed articles, many of them in Nature and Science. His previous books include The Story of the Human Body. He lives in Massachusetts. Dan is all of those things, and he's also a good friend. We became friends a few years ago when I emailed him out of the blue asking if he wanted to join me for a run. I happened to be in Cambridge, and so I sent him a note. So we met up for a long run around the Charles River one Sunday morning in the fall of 2019, during which we discussed many things, including his research on the evolution of biology, on the evolution and biology of running, as you do. We quickly discovered that we are both passionate about promoting physical activity, particularly among students and the alumni population. We finished up our run after a couple of hours and resolved to do something possibly along the lines of an organized fun run. Then, of course, the pandemic struck and lockdowns ensued all across the world. Dan and I continued to be in contact. We talked a lot about the mission of the HAA, which is to drive alumni engagement by connecting alumni all over the world with one another, and of course, connecting everybody back to Harvard. There were a number of dynamics at play here. Lockdowns meant that people felt a strong sense of isolation, travel was restricted, people were working from home. In many places, people were severely restricted in terms of the distances they could travel from their houses. So for example, in Ireland, you couldn't go beyond a 2-kilometer radius from your house. That in turn meant that people were doing less exercise, and concerns then grew about the combined effect of all of these factors on people's mental health. We teamed up with HAA Deputy Executive Director Sarah Carmone and Assistant Directors Megan DeMarchi and Chris Serwacki, and kicked around the idea of a global event that would take place around the same time that addressed many of the issues of concern and also drive alumni engagement at a time when we couldn't be physically together. We came up with the concept of Harvard Moves, 5K Your Way. We wanted to create an event that was inclusive in the sense that there were no barriers to participation. So people had a week to complete their chosen activity, whatever that happened to be. Walking, running, hiking. We even had people swimming. They were down in Florida. An event that connected our global alumni community of 400,000 and an event that promoted the benefits of physical activity in a way that was fun. And like many organized runs around the world, we created a giving aspect to it by nominating the Harvard College Fund as the beneficiary of any fundraising that was done. The results were absolutely staggering. We had almost 3,000 participants. We had every one of the 50 states and territories represented. Nearly 100 countries took part, and we raised over $70,000 in financial aid. And now we're doing it all again. If you haven't yet registered, please do so. I know Chris is going to put the registration link up in the chat. And if you have already registered, see if you can persuade one or two of your friends to join you. As it stands today, we have, I think, over 1,000 registered so far. Now, After this long introduction, let me hand you over to Dan, who was hopefully not too exercised that I've spoken for so long. Dan?
Thanks, Bob. It's really kind of you to introduce me, and I'm really glad we're doing this again. And it's nice to have this, on the one hand, it's really nice to give lectures in person, but I think one thing that we have learned over the pandemic is that Zoom is really an effective way to bring us together using technology, and it's better than not. So I'm happy to be here. And so what I'll do is I'll share my screen, and I'll give a presentation about 20-25 minutes, and hopefully that will leave time for plenty of discussion and questions and the like. So let me share my screen here in the classic Zoom fashion. Here we are. Hopefully that shows up. And just to re-emphasize what Bob was saying was that this is really the motivating factor here is the Harvard Moves 5K Your Way. And so please do get on the Harvard Alumni Association website, which is in the chat, and try to get your friends. If everybody gets 2 or 3 friends, we'll get an incredibly large number of folks. And as I said before, we're trying to raise money for the Harvard College Fund for students who need financial assistance. That's one of the things I really treasure about being at Harvard, is that we have so many students from so many diverse backgrounds, and it's a real privilege to be a professor here. All right, so with that introduction, let me get started. So today we'll talk about the paradox of exercise, and a good place to start is to make a distinction between physical activity, which is just moving, as you can see President Bacow here moving some first-year students in, and exercise, which is defined as discretionary physical activity for the sake of health and fitness. Okay, it's an important distinction. And I think the questions that many of us are interested in is how and why is physical activity healthy, right? Why does it promote health? And secondly, what can we do to help people exercise more? And I want to emphasize that Harvard has always played an incredibly important role in this question. In fact, the very, very first major epidemiological study on the effects of exercise on aging was done on Harvard alumni. It's called the Harvard Alumni Study. It was done by this gentleman over here, Ralph Paffenbarger, and it's still continued by Professor Ayman Lee, a good friend and colleague who's at the medical school. She was a student of Paffenbarger, so she's continuing the study. And Paffenbarger was a brilliant professor who realized that Harvard is a fantastic place to study aging and exercise, because as all of you know, when you graduate from Harvard, Harvard will never let you go, right? You could be stranded on a desert island, and the Harvard Development Office and the Alumni Office will still find some way to contact you about your reunion or giving something or whatever. And so he convinced Harvard to let him study alumni from a bunch of different classes. So there were a variety of classes from 1920 to 1950. Almost 17,000 alumni were surveyed over the course of quite a long time. And he collected data on their physical activity habits and whether they smoked and what kinds of diseases their parents might have had. And he got information on diseases that were diagnosed and recorded when they died and from what causes. And let me just show you briefly the kicker, figure. So this is from, of course, there are many papers that were published from this study, but let me walk you through this extremely famous paper from the New England Journal of Medicine in 1986. So on the x-axis here, we have physical activity, which he has broken into 3 bins in terms of calories per week spent exercising. So people who are doing very little are spending 500 calories a week being physically active. And here's 500 to 2,000 calories a week, and then more than 2,000. So to put that into perspective, 2,000 calories a week of physical activity is basically like going for a run 4 times a week. Okay, so this is not like crazy, physical activity. This is not running marathons or something. And you see there are 3 groups here. These are individuals who are from the age of 25 to 49 at the bottom, 50 to 59 here in the middle, and ages 70 to 84 here at the top. And on the y-axis, you've got all-cause death rate. So this is the rate at which people are dying per 10,000 years. And the numbers here are the relative rates, so they're standardized. So he standardized the all-cause death rate for 25 to 49 years old, which is probably around 30 here, 30 deaths per 10,000 years, and he's given that a relative rate of 1.0. So what this means is that in the 25 to 49 year age range, individuals who exercise 2,000 calories a week were dying at a 21% lower rate than the ones who were not exercising. In the 50 to 59 age range bracket, the alumni, the Harvard alums who were exercising 2,000 calories a week were dying at a 36% lower rate than their classmates who were not exercising, and a staggering 50% lower rate of alumni who are exercising 2,000 calories a week versus those who are not. So what this shows is that not only does exercise lower your death rate, but that the older you are, the more important physical activity becomes. And of course, this was the first of many studies, and this has been replicated in all kinds of different ways and ever since. But this was the very first major study, and it was done here at Harvard on Harvard alumni. And that study raises, I think, that of course, it's not that surprising that exercise is good for you. But to me, it raises what I call the exercise paradox, which is that if exercise is healthy, right, which we know it is, right, and I don't think you need a Harvard professor or a Harvard study to tell you that, but why is it that so few people do it? So according to data from the government, the CDC, less than 20% of Americans get the minimum level of physical activity that's recommended, 150 minutes a week. In fact, only 50% of Americans actually ever exercise at all. So that means that 80% of Americans don't get really a decent rate. And this is, of course, true for other countries as well. But of course, this is data from the United States. And in my opinion, a lot of those folks are exercised about exercise, right? To be exercised means to be confused and anxious and feel bullied and ambivalent about a topic. And I think we make people exercised about exercise. So my goal in the book that I published, Exercised, is to help us be less exercised about exercise. And there are sort of two sort of mantras, two philosophies that underlie this book. The first is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, and that includes physical activity. And that's because we weren't engineered or designed, we evolved. And so if you want to understand the human body, you have to understand that evolutionary history. But we're also people with culture. And so nothing about behavior, including physical activity, makes sense except in the light of anthropology. So I use the lenses of anthropology and evolution to try to help us think about exercise, why it's healthy, and how we can be less exercised about exercise. So for the next few minutes, what I'd like to talk about is how we evolved to be physically active but avoid exercise, how exercise got weird, why physical activity is increasingly healthy as we age, and then finally at the end talk about next steps, which, as you know, will include Harvard moves 5K your way. All right, so let's begin with a little bit of evolutionary history. So we could go back, of course, back to eons, but we're going to start with our evolution from the great apes, because our closest relatives are chimpanzees, and from them a little bit more distantly related to gorillas. And an important point to recognize is that gorillas and chimpanzees are basically couch potatoes compared to most animals. They're very, very physically inactive. Typical gorilla walks 1 kilometer a day. Chimpanzees walk about 3 to 4 kilometers a day. And until recently, of course, we evolved from chimpanzees around 7 million years ago. And until recently, all our ancestors, until 600 generations ago, in fact, were hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherers are really physically active. So what I've given you here is the physical activity level, which is your total energy you spend in a day, divided by your basal metabolic rate. So it's kind of a size standardized measurement of how active you are. And you can see that hunter-gatherers who walk on average about 9 to 15 kilometers a day, every day, for their whole lives pretty much, are about at least a third higher levels of physical activity, right? They're much, much more physically active than our ape ancestors. And in fact, hunter-gatherers are about 6 to 10 times more active than your average American. So MVPA stands for moderate to vigorous physical activity. So that's basically any activity that's that gets you up to like above half, 50% of your maximum heart rate. So a brisk walk or faster, right? So if you go for a walk and you're walking at a reasonable clip, that's moderate physical activity. If you go for a run, that's vigorous physical activity. If you go for swimming or playing volleyball, etc., that's vigorous physical activity. Your average hunter-gatherer engages in about 2.25 hours a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. Very few Americans get more than 20 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So we are basically much, 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 much less active than our ancestors until very recently. But the thing is about hunter-gatherers is that they struggle to get enough energy, right? They're physically active, but they can't just go to Whole Foods or Dunkin' Donuts or whatever they want to go to get some calories after they're active. They're constantly working in order to get food. So here's a hunter-gatherer mother with her child. She's digging up tubers and roots. she's struggling to get enough energy to pay for her metabolic needs and the needs of her child. In fact, she can't do it on her own. She needs her grandmothers to help, and other people in the community, fathers and grandfathers and whatever. It's a community effort to get everybody fed, but they're struggling to get enough energy, right? They're physically active, but struggling to get enough energy. And so when you have a limited resource, you have to engage in trade-offs. And the human body is no different, right? We get energy in, right? And then we can spend that energy on growing our bodies, on maintaining our bodies. We can store some extra energy as fat if we're lucky. We have to spend some of it on reproduction. We spend some of it on physical activity. And ultimately, the only thing that natural selection cares about is reproduction, right? In the cold calculus of selection, how many offspring we have who survive and reproduce is the only thing that natural selection cares about. So we're constantly engaging in trade-offs, right? So if you spend more energy on physical activity, that means you have less energy to spend on growth, maintenance, storage, and importantly, on reproduction. So when energy is limited and you have to be very physically active, the best strategy is to be physically active when it's necessary or rewarding in some other fashion, right? But otherwise conserve energy, right? And so that's what hunter-gatherers do. They do engage in as much physical activity as they need to, and as much physical activity that helps them get some benefit, like playing when they're young so they can learn skills, or dancing so they can have fun and meet mates, etc. But otherwise, they do what you and I do. They sit. So if you walk into a hunter-gatherer camp, this is actually a photograph of me when I walked into a hunter-gatherer camp in Tanzania, everybody's sitting. In fact, if you look at sitting, which we call in our jargon in my field, non-ambulatory activity, we can't just call it sitting, right? But it turns out that the Hadza, which are a group of hunter-gatherers in Tanzania that have been well studied, they sit on average 9.9 hours a day. That's actually not really different from most Americans. The average American in the United States sits somewhere between 9 and 13 hours a day. So they're doing the same thing that we're doing, right? Which is to take it easy when they can, right? And that makes sense. So if you walk into a hunter-gatherer camp, you'll never see anybody, lifting weights. Like, nobody buys weights for the sole sake of lifting them. That's not something our ancestors ever did. Okay. Now, that's the hunting and gathering world. And so people were hunter-gatherers until recently. And then farming was invented around 600 generations ago. But before tractors and other kinds of farm machines, farmers also have to work really hard, and they too avoid exercise. So this top photo here is from an area in Kenya where I do most of my field work. These are actually farmers from the village where we do research. And you can see these are guys got a plow. Here's the handheld plow. He's got some oxen pulling the plow. But let me tell you, I've held that plow. It's really hard work to plow a field. And they're also hoeing and sowing and processing all their food, and they have no plumbing, so they're carrying all their water and firewood, and I mean everything they do pretty much by hand. They have no machines to do any work for them. This is a Tarahumara farmer in Mexico. We've also done some research, also plowing by hand. These are Amish farmers in Pennsylvania, and we know that farmers in non-industrial farmers take on average, when we put Fitbits or step pedometers on them, they're taking 18 to 20,000 steps a day, whereas your average American today takes 4,774 steps. So farmers also have to work really hard. But what happened? How did exercise get so weird? And the term weird, by the way, is from my colleague Joe Henrich. The acronym stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And you need to understand that only about 10% of the world is weird. And that weirdness happened really recently in the last few generations, right? When we invented machines to do our work for us, where now we have elevators and escalators and dishwashers and clothes washing machines and plumbing and cars and shopping carts, and you can come up with all the gimmicks and gizmos that we use day after day to do our physical labor for us. And the end result is that we end up doing, as I said before, about 6 to 10 times less moderate to vigorous physical activity than hunter-gatherers, right? And as a result, we've had to invent this really weird thing called exercise, which is, as I said before, discretionary, voluntary, planned physical activity for the sake of health and fitness. So we invented all kinds of machines like treadmills and other bizarre sorts of things. And to me, the apotheosis of exercise, right, is this bizarre thing that some people use today, the treadmill. I mean, think about it, right? A treadmill is a machine that you spend a lot of money on, either in your own house or you go to a gym where you pay money, and it makes you work really hard and you get absolutely nowhere and you're just miserable, right, the whole time, right? It's loud and noisy, it can spit you off the back, etc. And if if you're like me and you think a treadmill is a kind of a form of torture, you're actually right. The treadmill was invented as a form of torture. It was actually the modern treadmill has its roots in Victorian England when they devised treadmill-like machines to punish prisoners people in debtors' prisons, so that make sure that they weren't really enjoying themselves. So you can think back to Victorian England and when you're next time on your treadmill. But it's healthy, whether it's a treadmill or working out in a field or whatever. It's healthy, right? So here's a graph from a very large study that was published a few years ago. This is over 660,000 individuals. And what we've graphed here, the bar charts, these histogram, is the minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity, the percentage of adults that do it. So you can see the vast majority of adults, this is from Europe and the United States, do none. And then you have declining levels of physical activity. But this gray bar here is the y-axis on the right side. That's the excuse me, on the left side, that's the relative risk of all-cause mortality. And you can see if you just hit 150 minutes a week, right, of physical activity, that's 21 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity, that is a 30% reduction in your all-cause mortality rate. And if you get to pre-industrial levels, you get to about 40% reduction, right? So it's a really powerful tool that we can use to prevent illness. Which brings up the second question I wanted to raise, which really goes back to this very famous Harvard alumni health study, which is, why is it that physical activity is increasingly healthy as we age? And for this, we just recently published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And I want to highlight my two co-authors, Professor Aaron Baggish from the medical school and also Professor Ayman Lee from the medical school. And we published this in PNAS. It's open access, and you can get access to it if you want to. But to explain it, I think we need to start with an important fact. So a lot of people think that today, we tend to live really long lives, and that hunter-gatherers in the past led lives which were nasty, short, and brutish, and that's actually not true. Hunter-gatherers, if they survive the first 5 years of life, actually typically live 7 or 8 decades. So the modal age of death in those populations for people who survive the first few years of life because of their high rates of infant mortality typically live between 68 and 78. And so that's the normal pattern of human life for probably millions of years, certainly hundreds of thousands of years. But that's very different from our primate relatives. So monkeys have a very short, brief life. They're basically dead by the age of 22, 25. Chimpanzees have slowed down their life history compared to monkeys. So they don't finish growing until they're about 12 years of age. Very few chimpanzees in the wild live beyond 30 or 40. And in zoos and captivity, they can sometimes live into their 40s and 50s. And I think the maximum ever is age 66. But hunter-gatherers typically live after they stop reproducing. So humans go through menopause and then live another 2 decades on average after menopause. So we evolved to become grandparents, okay? And that's something very special about human beings. The only other animal, by the way, known to do this is orcas, killer whales. Now, the other thing that's really important is that we evolved to stay very physically active as we age, because we're still hunting and gathering. There's no such thing as retirement if you're a hunter-gatherer. So here's a graph from our paper, actually. This is age on the x-axis, and this is minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And I've graphed American males and females here on the bottom, and hunter-gatherer females and males on the top. These are regression lines. So there's a lot of error around these. There's variation around these lines. But the important point to see is that, yes, as hunter-gatherers get older, they do less physical activity, but they're still doing way more activity than Americans of the same age, right? They're still doing 150 to 200 minutes a day of physical activity in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? So, and remember, they're doing this every day. There's no weekends, there are no bank holidays, there's no retirement. This is something they do throughout their life. And they're doing that, by the way, because they're collecting a surplus of food, and they're giving that food to their children and their grandchildren. They're also helping raise children, and they're doing all kinds of activities, right? Grandparents are really important in these societies. Now, that has good and bad news, the physical activity. Now, the bad news is that physical activity is stressful. That's why most people don't like it, right? It causes you to groan and moan, and you sweat, and you get hot, and it costs energy, right? So the stress, there are many kinds of stress, and I can't give them all the stresses, but for example, your mitochondria produce what called reactive oxygen species. These are molecules that are reactive, and they can cause, just like in an apple. If you leave the apple out, the apple will, the unpaired electrons will cause the apple to burn, right, to get brown. Well, that happens in your body all the time, and physical activity increases those reactive oxygen species that cause oxidation, cause browning. You get all kinds of cell and protein damage, not only from reactive oxygen species, but also from heat and from other metabolites. You get mutations in your DNA, your muscles start to develop tears, your bones get micro cracks, your mitochondria get damaged and get dysfunctional. And it also costs you energy, right? If you run for a mile, you're spending about 100 calories, right? So the bad news is that physical activity is stressful and costs energy, but obviously it's healthy for us. And the reason that it's healthy for us is the good news about physical activity, which is that because we evolved to be physically active, when you're physically active, you turn on an incredible range of repair and maintenance mechanisms. So yes, you produce all those reactive oxygen species, but when you're physically active, your muscles and other tissues produce an incredible amount of antioxidants. These are things that mop up and wipe out those reactive oxygen species. You turn on enzymes and proteins that repair your cells and repair protein and repair your DNA. You repair your muscles, you repair your bones, you repair your mitochondria. Every kind of stress that you can possibly imagine. There are repair and maintenance mechanisms that are activated by physical activity. And in addition, because when you're physically active, it also changes energy allocation. Remember, we talked about how when you're, physical activity requires energy allocation trade-offs. And when you're physically active, you end up allocating less energy towards storing fat, obviously, but you also send less energy towards reproduction. And the other way around to think about it is that when you're less physically active, what your body wants to do is actually send more energy towards reproduction. So it's not that physically active people are unable to reproduce, it's that people who are physically inactive, their bodies actually allocate abnormally high levels of energy towards reproduction, giving them, for example, women have much higher levels of estrogen and progesterone during the menstrual cycle, during the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, and that increases their likelihood of getting breast cancer. And so that raises, for example, one of many, many, many different kinds of effects. But this is data on the effect of physical activity, leisure time physical activity, on the risk of breast cancer on the left and all cancers on the right. And you can see that this is the odds ratio against the amount of physical activity you do. This is measured in something called metabolic equivalence. So a met of 1 is basically the energy you spend sitting. So if you have a met of about 25, that's about an hour of walking a day, right? And an hour of walking a day leads to approximately a 55% reduction in the risk of a breast cancer tumor that's either estrogen or progesterone sensitive. That's an amazing effect, right? And in fact, if you look at all cancers combined, an hour a day of physical activity leads to about a 30% reduction in any kind of cancer whatsoever, right? And that's because of reduced energy allocation plus excess increased allocation towards DNA repair and all those other functions that help keep your cells functioning and humming along. So the consequence of all this is that lifetime physical activity not only increases your lifespan, but actually increases your health span. Your health span is the number of years that you spend without having any major kind of disease or chronic disease or disability. And until recently, before modern medical care, health span was your lifespan. So today, your average American has a health span of about 63 and a lifespan of 79. That's the average according to CDC data. So that means that we spend on average about 16 years before we die with a variety of chronic diseases. We call that end-of-life morbidity. But even people who are moderately physically active have on average much longer health spans. So their health span averages about 79, and they also have longer lifespans. So just being physically active increases not only your health span, but also your lifespan. And importantly, those have an important interactive effect. Now, the problem is that we never evolved to be physically inactive, right? You couldn't be a sedentary, couch potato hunter-gatherer, right? That doesn't work, right? There is no such thing, right? And by the same token, because we were never evolved to be physically inactive, we never evolved to turn on those repair and maintenance mechanisms as much as when we're inactive as when we're active, right? So you can't just turn on all those mechanisms when you're sitting around in a couch, because we never evolved to do that. And so that leads to a mismatch, right? And the mismatch really is what shown in this graph here, which is that hunter-gatherers have long, as I showed before, relatively long lifespans, in which almost all that entire life is spent without morbidity. There's no healthcare, right? Then after the invention of farming, because there's more disease, more infectious disease, more people were living in villages with their, without sanitation with their animals, and there was no medicine, there was no antibiotics, there was no sewers, there were no toilets, there was nothing. Lifespan really decreased enormously, right? So average lifespans went from 60 to 80 down to 30 to 40, and now we have brought our lifespan back up, but with an extension of morbidity, because so many people are physically inactive in places like the United States. So yes, we're now living a little bit longer than our hunter-gatherers ancestors, but we're living many, many more years with chronic disease that do not occur in hunter-gatherer populations because of not just physical activity, but also diet. Diet's another story. So the bottom line is that lifelong physical activity slows senescence. So you can't prevent aging, but you can slow the rate at which your body starts to function less well as we age. That's senescence. And it decreases our vulnerability to an incredibly wide range of diseases. Physical activity is the #1 way, along with diet, of course, is important for preventing heart disease. It's incredibly important for respiratory tract infections. People at the beginning of the pandemic who were more physically active had a 2.5 times lower death rate from COVID than people who are sedentary. As I showed you before, physical activity lowers cancer rates. It is by far the most effective way of preventing Alzheimer's. It's extremely important for preventing diabetes. In fact, there's a big paper in Nature Medicine this week on that. It's important for arthritis and osteoporosis. And then finally, physical activity is also incredibly important for mental health and has major effects on depression. And so in the final analysis, we were selected to do moderate physical activity as we age. You didn't have to swim the English Channel or climb Mount Everest or run marathons or whatever. And we evolved to be active grandparents. And as a result, physical activity helps us stay healthy as we age and also keeps us stay as healthy grandparents. Now, I want to end a little bit on the present, because we have a problem right now, which is that according to some surveys, less than a quarter of our undergraduates at Harvard get 150 minutes a week of exercise. And that has both current and long-term concerns, right? One of the current problems is that we have a mental health crisis, not just at Harvard, but throughout the United States, throughout the world. Right now, currently 15% of Harvard undergraduates are diagnosed with either with a mental health problem, mostly of depression and anxiety. And we're concerned about another 46% of our students. So, and physical activity is not, of course, the only factor here, but it is one of many factors and important in the mental health situation. And then, of course, we care about the long-term health of our students, and we want to see our students end up in this category here in the 0.51 and the 70 to 80 category, rather than these categories here. It has long-term implications for health. So the bottom line is that we need to help get Harvard moving, and I think that the way to do that is that we should try to treat exercise like we treat education, right? As I said before, the hunter-gatherers are physically active, right, for only 2 reasons: when it's necessary and rewarding. And education is kind of the same thing, right? It's not something we also evolved to do. Nobody evolved to learn, physics or calculus or grammar. And how do we make it work at Harvard? Well, we make it both necessary, right? It's really important for your life, but we also make it fun and rewarding. And so I think that the more we can make it fun, make it social, make it rewarding, the more we can help people be physically active without making them feel exercised. And so I urge you to click on the link there for Harvard Moves and get as many friends as you can. Let's raise some money for help our undergraduates. But also, I also want to mention that we're working on a new program. In fact, I was just at a meeting right before I got on to this lecture, where we've been given a wonderful gift from a Harvard alum to help create a new program to promote physical activity on campus for the entire community and to study its effects on mental health. And you'll be hearing more about it. We're rolling it out next fall when the semester starts, and hopefully that will be effective. So with that, I will stop and look forward to answering questions and chatting with my good running buddy and friend Bob. And thank you very much.
That's great, Dan. You know what I was thinking as you were speaking, that this is probably the first conversation that you and I have had together where we've actually not been running.
Well, you know, I think running is a great way to have a conversation.
It is absolutely.
If you're running too fast to talk, you're running too fast, right?
Well, exactly right. And the ones that we have tend to go on for a couple of hours. So I think we're limited to like 25 minutes here. So we'll keep it we'll keep it within the time constraint. Really excellent, really interesting. The book is fantastic. I enjoyed reading it. So the lecture has generated a huge amount of questions, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them in the next 25 minutes. So what I'd like to do is maybe lump some of the questions together based on the general themes that are emerging. Okay, and so some common threads all the way through. So one in particular is around motivation. Lots and lots of questions about motivation. This one in particular: how do diet, sleep, and other lifestyle activities, for example, meditation, impact motivation and impact exercise?
That's a great question. I mean, let's remember again that exercise is a counterinstinctive behavior, right? You know, the example I like to think about, you know, we've all been in a subway stop or in an airport or, you know, a mall or something where there's a stairway next to an escalator, right? And it's just instinct. Even though there were no escalators in the Stone Age, you go right for the escalator because it's an instinct to save energy, right? And you know, every time I walk into the Peabody Museum, which is my office is on the 5th floor, I have to schlep up these 5 flights of stairs, and they're really tall stairs, right? Every day I want to take the elevator, every day, and I have a little mental battle as I walk into the building. And you know why I don't take the elevator?
Why is that?
If anybody catches me on the elevator, I'll be called out as a hypocrite, right?
Well, yeah.
I mean, it's not that I don't want to take the elevator; it's that I do, but my motivation to take the stairs is basically because I don't want to be a hypocrite, right? And I also know it's good for me, but I have to struggle, right? So all of us struggle to motivate ourselves to exercise and to do physical activity. And so there is no one way of doing it, but I think that the worst way of doing it is making people feel bad, right? Blaming and shaming people, being incompassionate, I think is what doesn't work. And but there's many other ways to get motivated, and I think the ones that work the best tend to be social, right? You know, when people do things together, it doesn't become exercise, it becomes fun, right? You know, going for a run with Bob is a fun way to talk to you. And I'm not thinking about the fact that I'm doing something really stupid, like running 13 miles just to so I can have a conversation with you, but that, you know, it makes it feel better, right? Or like dancing, right? Dancing is a form of physical activity, right? But who thinks about dancing as exercise, right? Because it's fun, it's rewarding, right? So I think there are many ways to make it to motivate, and I think we all have to find our own ways. And certainly, if you're stressed, you're time limited. I mean, the number one reason people say they don't the number one and number two reasons people give for not exercising are time, and the other is they don't find it comfortable or fun, right? And so I think that the solution is time is a challenging one, but I think we can all. You don't need to do like huge amounts of physical activity. Just climbing the stairs is beneficial. You know, 10 minutes a day can lower your relative risk of death by 20%, right? So you don't need to do enormous amounts of physical activity to get huge amounts of benefit. I think most people can find 10 minutes in a day. And then the motivation comes from not treating it as something like medicine, right? Exercise is medicine, which is no fun, like cod liver oil, but trying to find ways to make it rewarding. And I think that helps people with motivation. And we're all so different, our motivations vary so enormously, but we all need to find ways to make it rewarding and fun. And that's the motivation, really, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, on the point of surviving those runs together, I find that my best strategy is to ask you an open-ended question right at the beginning of the run. And I find that gets.
Well, I have friends, like I'm meeting another professor tomorrow morning at 7:15 on the corner here on Mass Ave, and we agreed to do this today because tomorrow morning at 7:15 I'm not going to want to be there, right? But I've now agreed and if I'm not there, I'll be a, I'll be a spoiler, right? So now I'm stuck, right? But I'll enjoy the run. We're going to have a great chat about this, that, and the other, and all that sort of stuff. So it's so have arranging it to do it socially is so effective. That's how I get myself out the door.
A friend of mine who's training for the Dublin Marathon, which takes place next weekend, called me recently, and he said, "Bob, I'm really struggling here. I find, like, I know that I need to go out and train, but I'm really struggling. I just find in the morning, I'm just not motivated on the subject of motivation. I'm just not motivated to go out and run. What's that about?" And I said, "Evolution." And he said, what do you mean?" So I gave him your email address.
Well, but it's normal, and people are made to feel bad for that, right? And we shouldn't make people feel bad for that. It is counterinstinctive to run a marathon. Nobody in the past lined up on a line and then ran as fast as they could, 26.2 miles to another line. For what? Like you're not going to win it, right? You're just gonna shred up your muscles and get exhausted and drive your family crazy and whatever. So we need to understand this is not a normal behavior, and people shouldn't pretend it is.
For sure. Here's another interesting one. If our ancestors lived much shorter lives than we do, how can we tell what kind of activity our bodies are adapted for in our 6th, 7th, and 8th decades and beyond?
Well, great question. And again, I think I want to emphasize that there's this misconception that our ancestors had short, nasty, brutish lives. That's true of once farming was invented, but our hunter-gatherer ancestors actually lived long and healthy lives. And if you go into these communities, I mean, I work with these communities, right? And you look for somebody with heart disease, you can't find it. There's no diabetes, there's no heart disease. Cancer levels are hard to measure in the field, but we have a pretty reasonable suspicion that they're much lower. A lot of the chronic diseases that we suffer from are much lower. And so the idea that we're now living much longer because than our hunter-gatherer ancestors is actually not really true. And actually, our health span is actually shorter now than our hunter-gatherer ancestors. So that's one part of the answer. But the other is that the kinds of physical activity that they're doing turns out it's not that complicated, which is that they're doing a mixture of endurance and cardio and strength, right? Cardio and strength. They're doing mostly cardio, but a little bit of strength. and you don't have to do a huge amount of cardio to get an enormous benefit. And you don't have to do a huge amount of strength training to get enormous benefit. So, the WHO recommendations are based on a lot of data, and they're not really that bad, which is that, everybody should try to shoot for a minimum of 150 minutes of physical activity a week, of endurance, sort of cardio physical activity. It can be anything you want: dancing, brisk walk, swimming, whatever makes you happy, right? And then try to do at least 2 sessions of some degree of strength training a week. I do push-ups and things like that. You don't have to go to a gym. You can do it against your own body weight. If you do that, you're kind of, that's basically what we need. We don't, if you mix it up a little bit, sometimes it's good to do a little bit of intensity and whatever. Mixing it up is good, but the most important thing is just to do something. And the real concern is for people who just don't do enough. And medicine can keep you going, but your vitality and health span will be much more likely to be longer and better if you do something.
Yeah. Let me move to another question here. Again, some of them, a number of questions kind of coalescing around the same theme. So it says, I would love to learn more about the link between physical exercise and cognitive function, and if there are particular movements that are better or worse to promote cognitive health. Arthur Lieberman, PhD, 69. Asked, does physical activity when you age improve cognitive function? So
I love that question. So, and there's no relationship, by the way, here, at least not to my knowledge. But anyway, it turns out that physical activity is incredibly important for cognitive function. And in fact, nothing, and I'm going to say nothing again, because I want to underline it, underscore it, bold capitals. Nothing comes as close to physical activity for preventing dementia, forms of dementia like Alzheimer's. And we don't know all the mechanisms, but one of them is that physical activity not only upregulates vascular flow in the brain, et cetera, but it upregulates a substance called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor, which is like, has been described by
off the tongue.
Which has been described by some as miracle growth for the brain. It actually causes new neurons to grow in the hippocampus, and it actually helps maintain the health of neurons in the cerebral cortex. There are many other factors that are also turned on by physical activity. And interestingly enough, BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic growth factor, originally evolved in muscles to upregulate muscle metabolism and was later co-opted by the brain to regulate brain health. So, and there are strong studies which show that increase in rats and in humans and in every way you can possibly think that physical activity upregulates BDNF, and BDNF improves cognitive function, decreases your rate of Alzheimer's, et cetera, and so there are other mechanisms as well that are important. So physical activity and cognitive function is strongly linked in terms of memory as well as memory loss and pretty much every aspect of, and also in mental health. Which is also cognitive. So it's really important.
I remember seeing a talk of yours, I think, where you made a comment at the end, asking a kind of a rhetorical question when people present with mental health issues to clinicians, that how often do they prescribe physical exercise, physical activity?
Yeah,
not enough.
No, I mean, look, it's not I'm not saying that you should not seek other forms of treatment, but it should be part of our armamentarium. And it's not an either or. Now, of course, I am very sensitive to the fact that it's not, you just can't tell people to exercise and expect them to do it. Some people have challenges to exercise. There are all kinds of disabilities and challenges that people have, and we need to be sensitive to them. But it's not something that we should ignore. But the other fact is that many physicians rightly see how challenging it is for their patients. I mean, if you're unfit, overweight, obese, whatever, fill in the blank, it can be difficult. And furthermore, the reward from being physically active is much harder. So if you weigh twice as much as somebody else and you try to go for a walk, you have to do twice as much work to do the same amount to walk the same distance. And furthermore, the dopamine reward that you get is less strong because you become dopamine insensitive, and dopamine is the molecule that gives you reward. So we need to be compassionate towards individuals who are struggling to be physically active and find ways to help them do so without nagging them and making them feel bad. And we're really not doing a very good job with that. Just telling somebody to exercise, oh, you're depressed, go exercise, is not a very effective way of doing that, right? So we need to find ways to help people do it in a useful, compassionate, and helpful way.
Yeah, you mentioned disability there a second ago, and I just want to talk about that for a second. I don't know if this person is actually on the webinar today, but I wanted to mention disability in the context of Harvard Moves 5K. So this person is Brooke Ellison. It happens to be her birthday today, so I want to wish her a happy birthday if she's watching. Brooke and I are involved in establishing a group of alumni around disabilities, or forming a kind of a shared interest group around disability. And she is a phenomenon. She's college class of 2000, Harvard Kennedy School class of 2004. She and I were in class together. At 11 years old, she was hit by a car and she's quadriplegic. She's a professor at Stony Brook University. She's a great friend. She is participating in Harvard Moves 5K in some way. She said she's going to work out a way of doing it. But she and I were chatting the other day, and I said, that's kind of blows me away. But anyway, I on her birthday, I wanted to mention her and also mention the fact that she's going to participate in it. So I think that's pretty special.
Yeah.
Okay. Eric Barron, class of 85, asks, why haven't our brains evolved to find exercise more rewarding?
Well, we do get some reward out of exercise, right? So we have endocannabinoids that can cause a runner's high. You get a dopamine hit so people who are exercise addicted do get a reward out of exercise. In fact, if I don't exercise for a few days, I mean, I'm a raging monster. My poor wife has to kick me out of the house. That's because my dopamine receptors are expecting that hit and I'm not getting it. So exercise can become extremely rewarding. The problem is that if you're unfit, your receptors become insensitive, and it takes a long time. It takes a few months of hard work before you get that, you build back up that sensitivity that gives it that reward. But even then, it's still, my dopamine doesn't get me out the door. Dopamine makes me feel bad after I come back from doing a workout or doing a run or something like that. And that's because, again, going back to that, what I was saying in the lecture is that we evolved. If you're in the Stone Age, right, and you're struggling to get enough food, and you're barely got enough food to pay for your needs and those of your family, going for a 5-mile run in the morning is a really stupid thing to do. It's actually counterproductive, right? So we didn't never evolve to do that, right? So asking people to go for a completely useless 5-mile run in the morning, or go to the gym and run on a treadmill, or whatever it is, it's really hard. And that's because we never evolved to do it. Just like we never evolved to pay taxes. I mean, who finds paying taxes rewarding, right? Nobody. That's another sort of modern strange thing to do. And we've overcome that like learning, complex math, right? We didn't evolve to do that, or learning to read. We didn't evolve to do that. How we make school function, right? How we make places like Harvard work is that we make it rewarding. It's fun to come here, right? You get classes, you get all kinds of classmates, and there's all kinds of wonderful things to do, athletic events, and cultural events, and there's Harvard Square, and I mean, even the dining halls are not that bad, and professors might not be that awful, right? But we make Harvard fun, right? And that helps us do something really weird, which is pursuing education, which we also never evolved to do. So that's just the way it is.
Brian Kretschmann, class of 2000, asks if you missed out. So there are a few questions around this theme of exercising later in life. So he asks, if you missed out on the protective benefits of exercising for a few years or decades, how beneficial is it to start exercising later in life? And there's actually a number of questions around, for people who are later on in life, what's the right balance of exercise?
Yeah, so this has actually been well studied. In fact, the most classic study is from the Aerobic Center, aerobic longitudinal study done in Dallas at the Cooper Clinic by Kenneth Cooper, who invented the term aerobics. And there's a series of studies in that center where they looked at people who started exercising early in life, people who never exercised, and people who picked it up, midlife, right? And what they found was that, yes, there's a benefit from starting when you're young, but people who start in midlife still get a significant benefit in terms of decreased rates of all-cause mortality, et cetera. And it turns out that what really matters more than how many minutes of exercise you get a week, which is how it's often prescribed, right, from a medical perspective, is actually how fit you are. And so fitness is actually a better predictor of vulnerability to disease and than just how much exercise you're doing. And again, people who pick up fitness later in life, because it's never too late to become fit, right? You can, so the answer is there's an enormous benefit to picking it up as we age, and it's never too late, and there's never too little that you can do. Even a little bit is better than none, and it has huge effects.
Michelle Ramirez of the School of Public Health, class of 2014, asks, with the obesity epidemic and the associated diseases and the diseases it causes, is it your opinion that the general population will change, or will it be the end of humanity?
Oh dear, oh dear.
Are we in a period of disevolution?
Well, yeah, like that movie WALL-E. I don't know if anybody's seen that movie, but well, here's the thing. there is no question that as industrialization sweeps around the world, and especially processed foods and machines that replace human labor, there's been an increase in cardiometabolic disease. Obesity is increasing, and even as like right now, there's like, I mean, I was reading about in Haiti this morning. It's a terrible food crisis going on in Haiti. It's an incredible haves versus have-nots situation. But anyway, so what's happening? So from a kind of medical epidemiological perspective, what we're getting is an increase in diabetes and in heart disease and in cancers, and these diseases are becoming more and more prevalent, and they're spreading now. Kind of the rates that we see in the United States are spreading to countries like Brazil and China and India that don't have the infrastructure actually to cope with these diseases. So what we're seeing is a serious increase in morbidity and mortality. At the same time, or where I work in Kenya, for example, there are now diabetes clinics, where they weren't like a few years ago. But is it causing evolutionary change? And the answer is probably not, because remember, what natural selection cares about is heritable variation that affects reproductive success. And most of the diseases that you get from being unfit or overweight don't really hit until you're your 50s or your 60s, until basically you're a grandparent, right? And so they're kind of silent to selection. So we can't rely on natural selection to solve the problem. We need to find cultural, political, social solutions to this issue. I don't think it's going to cause the human species to go extinct, but it is causing extraordinary. 75 to 80% of the time somebody walks into a doctor's office in the United States, it's for a preventable illness. And diet and exercise and stress are all, and tobacco are all key causes of that. And if we can do more to prevent those diseases, those illnesses, not only would we save money, we'll also, of course, more importantly, will reduce human suffering. And so physical activity is just a part of that.
Yeah, the impactful word there is preventable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we've time for one final question. So we'll take it from Janet Rowe in class of 73. She asks, in the study you shared of the age 70 plus group, were the exercisers and non-exercisers all capable medically of significant exercise?
That's a great question. So it is true that studies can be biased by the fact that if you're sick, then you can't exercise, right? So that'll exaggerate that difference. So that study, Paffenbarger was a very clever researcher, and those data, I didn't show you all the statistical corrections, but those studies are corrected for a variety of diseases to try to eliminate the effect of morbidity, reducing your ability to be physically active. But it's a good question, and it can cause a vicious, but what that raises is the vicious circle of inactivity, right? So when you become less physically active, you are more likely to get sick, and when you're sick, then you're less likely to be physically active. A very key example of that is sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is the loss of muscle mass as we age, and it's a classic vicious circle, because when you lose muscle mass, you become more frail and you lose functional capacity. That makes it harder to do basic tasks, which makes it harder to be physically active, which then keeps driving the sarcopenia forward. And that's why it's so important as we age to actually start doing strength training. It doesn't have to be a huge amount, but just a little bit of strength training is really, really, really important. But in answer to that very good question, yes, of course, you can epidemiologically, you can use, you can correct for illness and disease and morbidity to kind of remove that effect. And that's been done in plenty of studies. So there's no question that as people get older, after you correct for disability caused by disease, physical activity does have that effect of reducing vulnerability to a wide range of diseases.
Great, thanks, Dan. I just, before, like a final comment on from Dan on Harvard Moves, there have been a couple of comments about the 5K. Just to re-emphasize, we want to make the event as inclusive as possible. So Harvard Moves 5K, it's not strictly speaking 5K. It can be any physical activity that that you want to participate in. As we've said, we've had hikers, walkers, runners, people going out for a walk. I think Philip Lovejoy said he's going to take his dog for a walk. It's just trying to get everybody together and have fun around physical activity. Dan, do you have any closing things that you want to add?
Just have fun. Yeah, dance. And also if you can, bring some friends. The more people we can get doing it, the better. It's just a way of, I mean, I think we've been physically active as, we get this, think about going to the gym and going to it, under fluorescent lights and trudging on a treadmill, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that if you like to do that and you like to do that. But for millions of years, we've been going out and hunting and gathering and foraging and doing all kinds of stuff together as a species and gossiping and chatting and whatever. And I think that's the way to do it, right? Make it social.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll be seeing you in a couple of weeks in Cambridge, next week, I think.
Yes.
Thanks everybody for joining us from literally all over the world. And thanks to our friends in the HAA, to Sarah, to Chris, to Angela, to Linda, to Mariah, and to you, Dan, in particular. Good night from Dublin.